have a phenomenal panel for you all to learn from today. At my far left is Ebony Bridwell-Mitchell, Professor of Education and Faculty Co-Chair of the Education Leadership, Organizations, and Entrepreneurship program here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. In the middle, we have Matt Kraft, Associate Professor of Education and Economics at Brown University. And then immediately to my left is Heather Peske, President of the National Council on Teacher Quality, and formerly the Senior Associate Commissioner for Instructional Support at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And I hope that Heather will draw on her experience in both of those roles in today's conversation. You can find much more information about each of our panelists on the conference website, so I won't provide extended bios, but I can't resist saying that both Matt and Heather are graduates of our Doctor of Education program, and that we're grateful to them for coming back to Appian Way to join us today. So, why include a panel on the teaching profession in a conference focused on pandemic recovery? Well, in short, if there's one point of consensus among education researchers, it's that quality teaching is essential to student success. If we're going to help students recover from the impact of the pandemic, and if we're going to think beyond recovery to helping more students than ever before succeed in school and in life, then strengthening the teaching profession is essential. And the pandemic has clearly put that profession under tremendous strain. Teachers have been working longer hours. They report higher levels of stress. More than ever say they've considered quitting. And more school districts than ever are struggling to fill critical teaching jobs, prompting a spate of headlines about a national teaching shortage. At the same time, some analysts have pushed back on the narrative of a profession in crisis. Yes, more teachers report that they've considered quitting, but actual attrition rates fell during the first year of the pandemic. Some claim that districts are struggling to hire mainly because they're using relief funds to expand their workforces amid a historically tight labor market. So we want to take this conversation in the direction of talking about solutions as soon as possible, but I think it would behoove us to step back and try and get a good sense of the problems, the real problems that we're trying to solve. So, Matt, you're someone who has studied the teacher labor market throughout your career. You've continued that line of research on into the pandemic. Based on your work, what is the current state of the teaching profession? And are the challenges we see solely or primarily due to the pandemic, or do they reflect long-standing issues?
I think as a nation, we should be gravely concerned about the state of the teaching profession. Full stop. And I don't say that lightly or frivolously or to grab headlines. I say that based on a wide range of data that we have available to track the overall health and well-being of the teaching profession. And I think it's fair to say, and I'll provide a few specific examples, that the overall well-being and status of teachers in this country is at or near its lowest point in a half-century. And I also think these data suggest very clearly that this is not about an immediate effect of the pandemic and the crisis that it has caused in our education system. These challenges well predate that crisis. But of course, as you mentioned, Marty, they have accentuated the challenge before teachers and the challenge before school systems to support them. And so this decline in a whole range of measures has started most recently in roughly around 2010. And we can look at measures of overall public perceptions of the prestige of teachers in the profession. We can look at measures of the percentage of high school students or college freshmen who report they intend to enter the profession or would be interested in doing so. We can look at measures of simply the number of new teaching licenses that are issued by states. And we can also simply ask teachers through a range of ways what their experiences are on the job. And Across all 4 of those measures, we have seen precipitous declines over the last 10 years. For example, between 2009 and 2022, the percent of parents who want or would be excited by the prospect of their children entering the teaching profession has fallen by half. You can ask students themselves, polls of high school seniors, college freshmen, about whether they would be interested in joining the profession, show that since the 1990s, the percentage of college students and high school students that express interest has also fallen by half, with 38% decline in just the last decade alone. We can count the number of folks who actually earn a teaching license, and as many have shown, this has fallen by a third over the last decade. And finally, just asking teachers, we know that the percent of teachers who say the stress of the job, we heard from the secretary that this is a challenging occupation, and we know that, and teachers lean into that. But the percentage of them who say that that stress is no longer worth it has, or excuse me, let's reverse that, because the statistic is the percent who say that it's worth it to remain in the profession despite those stresses has gone from 81% a decade ago to just 42% today. And so I think we have to be clear-eyed about the moment we're in, but also understand that this is not just about responding to the pandemic. This is about thinking about the structural challenges and the erosion of the infrastructure of the teaching profession. And we can also think that we are not in a unique moment in the history of our profession. There have been times before, for example, in the late 1970s, when the teaching profession also faced considerable challenges and was able to overcome those through a range of national efforts. And so I think we should be very concerned, but also maintain the hope and focus on solutions as we're doing today.
Thanks, Matt. So Heather, Matt offered a pretty dire analysis of the situation. Now, your position leading a national organization focused on improving teacher quality gives you a unique vantage on the profession as a whole. You know, how does your assessment of where we are differ, if at all, from Matt's?
Well, I think Matt's data is real and realistic. I wouldn't present it as bleakly as you did. And mostly, I would say, my concern is that right now, we've produced a narrative in this country, mostly through our media, about the teacher shortage that completely lacks any nuance. And in response, state policymakers, in an effort to respond to a teacher shortage, real or imagined, have created policies that totally lack nuance. They're like knee-jerk policy responses, and they're hurting the profession, and in so doing, they're hurting kids. So since in the last 2 years, 19 states have put in place some kind of emergency licensure provisions or gone backwards from standards for entering the teaching profession. This is not helpful if you're trying to produce learning in students when you have a bunch of people entering the profession who have no content knowledge, no pedagogical skill, no understanding of child development, and God forbid we ask them to give mental health supports to kids because they don't know what they're doing. That is a huge problem for our profession, and more importantly, it's a huge problem for our students. And we know from the data where those unqualified, inexperienced, unsupported people go to teach. And to be very blunt, they don't go teach my white daughters living in upper middle class households. They go teach black and brown kids who live in poverty, who are students with disabilities, who are multilingual learners. We have to stop implementing policy without any knowledge. The data that Matt described is national data. We can't answer questions in most of our states, such as the following. What do your vacancies look like? What do they look like now? And what do you predict they'll look like 2 years from now? How many math teachers do you actually need? How many math teachers do you have coming out of your teacher preparation programs? So the shortage is in the dearth of data. Now, certainly we have shortages in various subjects. We've long had them. They've persisted, such as STEM, teaching students with disabilities, teaching English learners, multilingual learners. We also have shortages in specific regions. Commissioner Schwinn earlier today talked about Tennessee and the shortages in rural counties in Tennessee. That's very real. But we need much better data, much more targeted, timely, accurate data in order to then propose policy solutions that are targeted and specific and that elevate the profession, and in so doing, better serve kids.
Thanks, Heather. So, Ebony, a lot of your research focuses on the organizational conditions that teachers experience that support their individual and collective agency. How does that perspective and others that you bring to the conversation add to the picture that Matt and Heather have drawn?
Well, for me, it's super helpful to actually hear both of the panelists talk about kind of the national picture of what's going on, because as you're saying, my work really does focus on kind of the context in which teachers are doing their work. And I think one of the ways that I think about kind of the statistics that Matt is sharing is really thinking about not so much a devolution in the teaching profession or an erosion of that, but thinking of it from a kind of form of protogenesis or becoming. Like, it is true that we're not where we need to be. But if we think about where we are right now as an opportunity to do the kinds of things that have to happen for professional work to thrive, then we're in a situation where we can ask ourselves questions like, well, what are the kinds of relationships that have to exist amongst teachers in school buildings to make school the kind of place where not just students want to go to, but where people want to go to work? What are the kinds of things that we can do to create a shared body of knowledge, not just in the profession like we are developing here at HGSE with our own teacher professionalization program, but also what do we do to develop a shared body of knowledge in the actual schools themselves? People are working together as professionals. People are constructing their understandings of what is the work we do here? What makes this work meaningful? What is it that I need to bring to the table not only for students, but also for my colleagues? And the more we think about how to kind of make this connection between what's going on at the national level, between thinking about all of the data that we have that tells us here are what the problems are and maybe what the policy solutions are, the more we go from that to thinking about how do we put into action on the ground in school and district contexts what we know has to happen to support the conditions, the organizational conditions, the social conditions, to get schools to work well for both students and staff. I think the better off that we'll be in terms of not only developing the profession, but getting the outcomes that we want for our students and our schools.
So let's start thinking towards solutions that would address some of the challenges that you've laid out. I've found that conversations about improving teaching often distinguish between strategies to recruit and retain strong educators and then strategies to improve the quality of instruction that educators provide once they're in the profession. So let's start by thinking a little bit about the former on the recruitment and retention front. And Ebony, I think you were just starting to get at the working conditions that could matter, particularly for retention. I wonder if you could be a little bit more specific about what it would look like to think about working conditions. That was one of Secretary Cardona's 3 ABCs for improving teacher quality, better working conditions. Also agency, something you think a lot about. What does that look like to think about that as a lever for attracting and retaining teachers?
Yeah, that's obviously a super important question, or you would not have asked it. But one of the things that I think about when I ask about attracting people to the profession, I really think about what motivates people to want to engage in certain kinds of work. And when we're talking about what motivates people, we know, meaning people who study organizations know, there are some factors that are really like just get you to the threshold. And quite frankly, there are things like salary or having a starting bonus or even, honestly, working conditions. There are these factors that like set the baseline, that get people kind of over the initial hump, but they're not the kinds of things that get people to want to stay somewhere, to be committed to their work, to be invested, to feel like they're thriving. Those kinds of conditions are the ones where we're actually providing ways for people to be recognized in their work, providing professional pathways for advancement, helping people have a sense of meaning in their work. And that meaning comes not just from the work they do with students, but one of the reasons I love being at HGSE, love being in our profession, is because I get a chance to interact with colleagues who help me feel smarter, who help me be better. And so when we're talking about how do we attract people to the profession, we're talking about helping people see and, quite frankly, creating the conditions in which people see schooling as a place where teachers can advance, can be recognized, can find meaning in their work. And that happens at the building level. We heard in our last session from Secretary Cardona that sometimes we're not thinking about principals as much. But principals are the people closest to the work teachers are doing who can help create those conditions for those kinds of motivational factors that do help people feel like they're thriving.
Great, Matt, I want to come to you on this question of strategies for recruitment and retention. In my extensive research for this panel, I checked Matt's Twitter feed, and I saw that you had actually done a little bit of personal reflection on this question in recent days. So help us understand.
Well, like many people here, I was a public school teacher, and I think we all as educators feel the weight of the conversations you have with your peers and your parents and your colleagues about when you introduce yourself as, hi, I'm a teacher, or I'm thinking about studying education, and the reactions and responses you get. And so, we've heard a lot about elevating the profession with more prestige, with respect. I think there's no doubt that that is integral, but that is, frankly, generational work. There is not a policy lever that we can pull, to immediately make that change. But there are things that influence it, certainly. And building on what Ebony said around professional advancement, if you ask high school students who, when they take the SAT, would you be interested in the teaching profession? And if they say no, follow up and ask them why. The number one reason they say is because of low pay. That won't be surprising to anyone. That has to be addressed. But that's not alone sufficient. We may be able to get them there, but we may not be able to keep them. The second most common reason they mention is the lack of opportunities for career growth. Teaching, as we've designed it, is an extremely horizontal profession. If I had stayed as an educator in the schools where I worked, my title likely would have been the same over a 3-decade-plus career unless I chose to move into administration. It does not need to be that way, and I think many have argued that it shouldn't, that there are opportunities for career ladders to build on the expertise that exists in every school building and leverage that as internal mentors for new teachers, as school-based coaches, but not in the way that we currently do, which is a one-off trivial stipend and added on top of the full duties that a teacher has, but an actual career ladder. But again, we seek solutions and we think about them because it's hard to change systems in individual terms. But the reality is that one solution alone will always be undercut by the lack of a coherent approach. If we get them in the door, but we can't keep them, then what's the value of bringing them in? And so I think we have to ask, what is it that keeps teachers there? And I always go back to Susan Moore Johnson and her colleagues' work, which has shaped a lot of my own work, about the critical role of teachers' sense of success. Mm-hmm. They do the work because it brings them joy to feel like they are making a difference in students' lives. And some work that I've done with my colleagues, Mimi Lyon and Nicole Simon, showed that during the pandemic, those teachers who were working in schools that they reported to have among the strongest working conditions were 7 times more likely to maintain a sense of accomplishment and success with their students as they felt, compared to those teachers working in schools in the lowest quintile of working conditions. It matters for how they experience their work on the job. And so I think it's about getting them in the door with the right types of compensation and career ladder opportunity, but keeping them there by giving them the support they need to succeed.
Heather, how does the National Council on Teacher Quality think about these issues?
It's funny, I was actually thinking with my state hat.
Good.
So I like to think about systems, and I like to think about how we bring coherence to systems. And when I think about systems that have impact on teachers, I think about the actors who have the most influence. So I think about teacher preparation programs, I think about states, and I think about districts. And I think about what each of those actors, and I hope that as I say those, you each think of yourself in one of those parts of the system, or an additional part, which is advocacy, nonprofit, legislative organizations, sort of more governance outside of those other three actors I mentioned. So I think the question for me as a state policymaker was, what could I do at the state level to impact the quality and effectiveness and retention of our highest performing teachers in our schools? What could I do to ensure that we had a diverse and effective workforce in our schools, and do that from the state policymaker perspective? And I will say, Tom Hare, who's a former professor here who sadly passed away this summer, used to talk about policy as being such a blunt instrument. And the more and the bigger your scale, the more blunt it becomes. So in Massachusetts, I was trying to design policy along with my amazing team and others at the department to impact 1 million students and 79,000 educators. So to get to the question of recruiting and retaining, you have to think about the continuum of the teaching profession. So how do you ensure that you have standards for teacher preparation that are aligned with the content knowledge that your students are going to know and that your teachers need to know in order to teach? How do you ensure that principals have standards both for pre-service so they're well prepared, as well as standards for evaluating them and giving them feedback and coaching them so that they can grow? How do you, as a state, influence collective bargaining agreements in the states where there are collective bargaining agreements? How do you work with the union to try to impact those collective bargaining agreements such that you can have differentiated pay structures that are more likely to attract and hopefully retain teachers? So I guess I don't have lots of answers, but I would just say that I would hope that we try to promote a systemic approach. I think the secretary used that word earlier about systems over superheroes, because only in that way will we be able to actually retain the teachers we most need.
So you jumped ahead a little bit on where I was going in the conversation, which is just fine, because I actually was thinking about how at the state role, in your state role at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, you put a concerted focus on improving instructional quality, right? Not just who's coming into the profession, but trying to shape what they do in the classroom. And so I wonder if you could reflect on that and tell us a little bit about the levers that are most powerful there, keeping in mind that sitting at the state level, you are relying on some blunt instruments.
Yes, and just so you all know, it's very weird to be on stage and not a student. And so I hope that all of you think of yourselves as, like, eventually you will be sitting here. Maybe not even eventually, maybe next week. And I will say that when you look around this room in like 20 years from now, as I look back 20 years ago when I was here, you're making connections with people who you will then see later. So Marty is a member of the state board in Massachusetts. So I frequently had to go in front of him and present what we were doing, and he would ask his probing Marty-like questions. Similarly, Matt last week just sent me feedback on a paper that my organization, NCTQ, is putting out. And I was like, Matt, seriously? Because he gave some really hard critical feedback. So I say that to say, I'm building on the previous session about the importance of relationships in this work. So to your question about the state agency and what we tried to do in order to support high quality instruction, there are a number of things. One is, first, we revised all of the standards for students. The ELA standards, the math standards, the history social science standards, the science standards, the arts standards, and which includes all of the performing arts. So in the 10 years that I was there, we tried to ensure that we had thoughtful, meaningful standards that supported what kids should know and be able to do. And I'm very proud of the good work there. They're still flawed, there's still a lot of work to do, but that's one place to start in terms of instructional quality, is ensuring that you set expectations for kids that are meaningful. Another place that we did a lot of work is on revising the criteria for educator preparation programs and what they should be teaching aspiring teachers. And I will say this is one place that I failed, and I'm among many. I'm very pleased that the team has picked up on this. So earlier today, Dr. Santelises, Sonia, she spoke about the importance of the research base in early literacy and the fact that we have a so-called science of reading, which is grounded now in brain research over decades that tells us how we should be teaching kids to read and how we should not be teaching kids to read. And so here in Massachusetts, for a long time, we didn't make clear to our teacher preparation programs under my leadership what they should be teaching aspiring teachers in terms of teaching elementary kids how to read. I'm really pleased to say that in the last few years, that's been rectified. Right now, there are draft standards for what ed prep programs should be doing in order to teach kids, teach aspiring teachers how to teach students to read. And so those types of standards are what you can do at the state level in order to impact the instructional quality in classrooms. Again, it's a blunt instrument. And then you can do things like revise your licensure exams to ensure that they actually align with the content that we're asking kids to know and to make sure that the teachers actually have that knowledge. There again, we waited a really long time and then finally did that. Additionally, we spent $32 million out of ESSER funds in order to supply districts with access to high quality instructional materials and aligned professional development in an effort to say there is now clear evidence that when you choose certain curricula that is high quality, that is standards aligned, usable, it has assessments built in that are thoughtful and meaningful for kids, those high quality materials matter in terms of student outcomes. And there are materials that we are using in classrooms today that are not good for student outcomes, and they should be abandoned. And so we put $32 million worth of ESSER funds into saying to districts, here's the list of curricula that we have vetted. In Massachusetts, there was no way we were going to mandate curricula. Penny, Commissioner Schwinn was talking about earlier, they have like 3 curricula that they use in the entire state of Tennessee. And I was like, good heavens, we had 400 districts and like hundreds of curricula being used. But if you try to put the incentives in place to make the best choice the right choice, people generally follow on. Dana Brown, my colleague, who's a longtime principal and superintendent, is nodding because we did this work together. So what I'm saying is that the instructional core can be impacted by policies, by incentives, and by capacity building, and you have to do it all along the way of the system.
Ebony, why is it so hard for reforms to improve the quality of instruction, and how does it sometimes nonetheless occur?
I am smiling to myself saying, do we have how long for me to describe the answer to this? But when I am thinking about the work that I do around how institutions work and what we know about what makes it the case that they tend to stay the same, even when we try and push back. Oftentimes, while it does sound like institutions is an abstract term, it comes down to what's happening on the ground when we think about, for example, people getting together in one of the situations or one of the circumstances, which is in fact one of the most powerful tools for change, like teacher learning communities. We heard the secretary talk about how putting professionals together in and around practice problems is powerful, but often that doesn't turn into great improvements in schools, not just because teachers may not be focused on instruction in those particular situations, but also because we haven't created the social conditions for certain kinds of, new ideas to come up, for people to look at each other and say, critically, what have we been doing? Is this really working for students? And what role might I be playing or not playing in the kinds of improvements that have to happen? Also, when teachers are working together in these groups, we're not often saying to them, okay, how do we think about not only having a diverse set of expertise, but creating norms where people feel like they don't have to stay silent when someone is saying something different from them, but they feel confident to take a risk. And not only do they feel confident to take a risk and say something different, but they feel supported in doing so. There's a norm not only for challenging each other, but for taking risks, and not just a norm for taking risks, but actually being rewarded for doing something. I started my early career as a teacher, and I don't think this has changed much since then. Oftentimes going against the grain is something that is not only difficult and scary to do, but there are very few rewards for doing it. It makes your life harder. It makes your colleagues say, what's that lady doing when we're all doing this? Also, even if you wanted to do it, it becomes infeasible sometimes. The way resources are allocated, the way you have access to your own time and effort, all of those things make it difficult to, even when you have an amazing tool like teacher teams that could be a force for dramatic change, because we're not organizing the work in those particular types of situations in ways that make it possible for us to conceive of or reimagine, as we heard in the last session, to conceive of doing things differently and put that into action and be rewarded for doing so. It makes it almost impossible for us to get things to become different.
That was a lot in a short period of time. Pretty good. So, hey, Matt, one of the ways we know that the quality of instruction can improve is that it happens quite naturally with experience, right? We know that teachers become more effective early in their careers. Your research has shown a couple of things. One is that trajectory of improvement sometimes goes longer into educators' careers than is often understood to be the case. And also that teachers improve more rapidly in some schools than in others. What can we learn from that about improving instructional quality?
Well, I think essentially we need to see students' learning conditions also as teachers' working conditions. And so what is good for students is also good for teachers. And we need to think about ways in which we can create cultures building on this idea where there is enough trust to challenge the pedagogical move that your colleague made is perhaps not the best one to have made, or to suggest an alternative. And I think the research suggests that a structure to do that, to facilitate that, exists. Teacher coaching. And that is a broad umbrella term. But when you look at the evidence aggregated across the body of rigorous randomized control trials that have been conducted, I think teacher coaching stands out as one of the most efficacious things we have in our tool belt to help support teachers on the job learning. Now, that may come in the form of a formalized role, but research by Eric Taylor and John Pape and others, I think, shines a light on the power of less formalized peer observation and review protocols that allow people in the building to observe each other and to provide feedback and to put the infrastructure of the time it takes to make that happen and the space to do that. But in order for that to succeed, you have to trust your colleague that they're going to hear you. You are going to be vulnerable. You're going to be opening your door. And not all schools have built cultures that facilitate that. So this top-down policy lever, oh, coaching works. We pull it. But it then parachutes into contexts where it doesn't have the fertile soil to grow and to be successful. The last thing I'll mention briefly, building on, I think, Heather's excellent point, that these national pictures of the teacher labor market really miss the detailed, differential, local nature of it, is that we can talk about teacher pay and the need to elevate it. And that is, I think, extremely important, but it's not sufficient. We need to also think about paying teachers differently. And I'm not talking about performance pay or merit pay. I'm talking about pay that reflects the fact that it is exponentially harder to hire a math teacher in a high school than it is a history teacher or a special ed teacher relative to an elementary school teacher. And there are ways in which we can try to support not only that challenge, but also the reality that particularly in large urban schools where working conditions can vary dramatically, but pay is standard across those schools, that there are acute inequities across individual schools that are particularly hard to staff that we essentially allow to persist by having a very rigid and inflexible salary structure.
So we have a lot of ideas on the table. One way to think about it is we have a lot of potential levers for improving, for supporting, for rebuilding the teaching profession. I want to take the conversation in the direction of more concrete, tangible examples of places that are trying things that you all see as promising. And I think that's important to do because this is both a moment of challenge in the aftermath of the pandemic, but it's also a time of opportunity. One reason is that most school districts, at least temporarily, have unprecedented levels of resources that could be devoted to improving the conditions for teaching and learning. The focus on pandemic recovery itself could be an opportunity to address some of these long-standing challenges. So, Heather, are there examples of states or school districts that are undertaking promising strategies, and what can we learn from those about the conditions for creating change?
There are so many good examples, and that's where I do hope that we end in this optimistic way. I would look to Mississippi. We looked to Mississippi when I was in Massachusetts here, particularly their efforts around early literacy, where they took a hugely systems-based approach. They offered training in letters training, which is an early literacy-based science of reading training for teachers, also for ed prep faculty. They set standards for educator preparation programs about how to teach reading. They provided reading coaches in some of the, at first, lowest performing schools, and then in all of the schools. And they've seen improved results on the NAEP. And it's just, there's a lot more investigation into what it is specifically that they did, but that's one place that I would cite as a really interesting example. The other is Tennessee, which you heard from this morning. And I think very interestingly, what they did in the pandemic is that they put in place some expectations. Like, for example, if you're gonna get licensed in Tennessee, you have to serve as part of what they call the All-Core, Tennessee All-Core, which I think stands for like something improving literacy and learning or access to literacy and learning. But essentially, if you want to get licensed in Tennessee as a new teacher, before you do that, you have to serve in a school as a tutor for a certain number of hours. That's just so logical. I was like, Penny, why didn't we think of that? In Massachusetts, we tried to put all this money into tutoring, but we couldn't find people to be the tutors. And so it's one thing to talk about these interventions, it's another to find the staff. The other thing Tennessee did is they have differentiated and provided varied roles for teachers, accompanied by quite large allocations of increased salary dollars. And so there's like a menu sounds too flippant, but there are like differentiated roles that you could select from as a demonstrated high-performing teacher that allow you to take on additional roles and responsibilities and be compensated for so doing. To Matt's earlier point, it's not just sort of an add-on. And to Ebony's point, this then builds the conditions within the school where you have master teachers as well as recognition of teachers who are still developing. So I think there's a lot of really interesting, exciting work out there. The pandemic cracked open what Lordy in the 1960s called the egg crate model of schooling. Because as teachers, like, we had to know what the other third grade teacher was doing, because if she went down to COVID and had to go home for 10 days, I needed to know, in order to help the substitute, what was happening in her classroom. So I think we can capitalize off of this collaboration and off of these interesting models.
Matt, I want to ask what you're excited about as well, but I also want to note something that struck me about your last response, which was that you started out with the point that teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions. That's often a phrase used by the National Education Association, other teachers' unions. You ended your response by calling for much more differentiation in pay and in roles, which are ideas that unions have traditionally been uncomfortable with. So if that's one of the things you're excited about, help us understand how we might sort of make progress and solve the politics behind going in that direction.
Well, you're the expert on the politics, Marty. I should be asking you that question. But I guess today I'm an equal opportunity offender here and proposing things that not everyone can find something to disagree with. But one thing I think we can be realistic about is that, if anything, the pandemic has shown how public perceptions of the teaching profession can change, and rapidly so. I mean, we saw in those first weeks and months of the pandemic an outpouring of appreciation and deeper understanding of what it means to have young kids with you, 9 to 4 every day of the week. And I don't think you really understand that, although we think we do because we were all students. But until you are on the other side of that table, you don't fully appreciate the superhero-like work that it takes to be an effective educator. At the same time, then, that appreciation and respect quickly eroded when teachers were cast as kind of keeping school doors closed, and the politics kind of became much more enmeshed in how we were serving kids as the pandemic persisted. I think teachers have an incredible opportunity to advocate both for what they need and to step up and play a greater role in establishing their own standards for the profession and holding those high standards. And frankly, I think unions have had their backs up against the wall to scratch and scrape for any amount of increased compensation they can get. And so they've had to, go rank and file to get anything they can. But if we didn't force them in that corner, I bet you they might be more open to this type of differentiated approach to compensation. And I think there are a number of places, as a recent Future Ed report highlights, that are working with districts to allow for these types of more differentiated pay. In terms of what specific thing might I point to as something to get excited about that's happening is, I've done a lot of work on the potential role of tutoring, but I want to focus in on one sub-element of that, which is peer tutoring. What does that mean? It means having your high schoolers start to work one-on-one in an elective class or an after-school club or as part of a community service program, mentoring and tutoring students who are in the middle schools and elementary schools that they came through. And I think we're just learning about that, and we should certainly continue to learn. But there is just an intuitive appeal to the notion that we have this source of potential tutors while the labor market is incredibly tight and challenging to find other tutors that know the context in which we're asking them to work and reflect the backgrounds of the students they might work with. And that won't be for everyone, but I think we underestimate the potential of the knowledge and care that our own students want to bring to give back to their own community and schools.
Interesting. It's an approach to try and increase the overall instructional capacity of the system in some sense, and also another example of differentiating roles in a way that supports what teachers do in the classroom. Ebony, what are you most excited about?
Well, I'm so glad that Matt picked up or started this point about peer tutoring, because when I was thinking about examples, and I will have two that are optimistic and one that I will end on that is realistic, not pessimistic, realistic. But this idea of having peer tutoring also picks up on this idea of what the greatest source of new teachers are for the future, which are the students who are in the schools. And a school that I spent some time working with in Rhode Island, in Providence, so talking about pockets of excellence, even in places where there's a lot of work to do. A school called Mount Pleasant High School has an academy, a professional academy for teaching in its high school, so that young people, so we talk about how are we bringing students to the workforce. The workforce for teachers are right there with the students already. So an opportunity to learn how to and get excited about teaching through peer tutoring, but also through learning the kinds of skills that are involved in actually helping other people to learn. We were talking before about how do we bring unions along. I loved your point about if we didn't push unions into the corner all the time, they probably would be more ready to do lots of things. But also when I think about the case of Baltimore, so a former colleague, Andres Alonso, who was here, they did so much work in Baltimore to kind of create career pathways, to differentiate pay. And for the most part, the union, Matt, not only came along with them, but were excited to do the work. And we have a case on Andres' experience, the PELP case. I will never remember the numbers, S0895. Type in Google, but kind of thinking about the Baltimore case, because that was one of the few examples I have seen where it really was kind of as close to a collaborative effort, and even the union being excited about things that normally they would have kind of pushed back against. So those are two positive examples. Maybe professional academies for teachers inside schools in the Baltimore case. The one realistic thing that I will say, I am a realist by heart. I cannot say anything else but that. It's not an example of what to do. It's an example of what not to do. So I will not name any specific names, but one of the things that happens most often when it's time to create change is that we hear we hear. Leaders in schools and in districts hear about best practices. There's plenty of money available. And so they say to themselves, we'll adopt this thing that everyone else is adopting. And so this thing that we're adopting, maybe it's putting new devices in schools. Maybe it's having a peer tutoring program. It sounds great. And on average, maybe that is the thing that works. But when it comes to the actual root causes of the things that are keeping improvement from happening in those schools, that best practice doesn't actually work for the root causes in a particular school. So the one thing that I would encourage every school and every district not to do is not to ask carefully and critically, does this one great thing work in our context? And what would it take for this one great thing to work? What conditions would have to exist in our schools to get this thing to work? And if you cannot create those conditions, even for the best practice, that is not the best practice for your particular school or district. So don't get caught up in what sounds like a good idea.
I think Ebony may have just done what I was going to ask each of the panelists to do to close out our time together, because unfortunately we have reached the end of the time allotted for the panel, and that was to offer sort of one final piece of advice for a leader or a policymaker. You get to pick your level. We've talked across ideas at the macro level, state or federal, the meso, district, or school micro within the school. Ebony taught me those words. And so you get to pick your audience, but as we think about all the various dimensions of the challenge, the potential opportunities to strengthen the profession in this moment, what's your closing advice? Ebony, anything to add to what you just said?
Consider me closed out.
All right.
Colleagues?
I'll offer one piece of advice and steal an additional specific suggestion. The piece of advice I have is that we've heard throughout today about the unique moment we're in, not only because of the challenges, but also the opportunity that the billions of dollars of federal aid have provided for schools and districts. But I want to have a clear-eyed understanding of the nature of the incentives around that funding. That is an unprecedented amount of money, but it will go away. And that in itself structures the incentives of what school leaders do with it. And I don't think we recognize that enough. We don't give enough credit to the district leaders and school leaders that know what it's like to have your money dry up. And I think they're making strategic decisions about how to spend that money so they're not left holding the bill when in 2025 that money is gone. And so I don't think that we, without much more careful planning about long-term budgeting projections and sustained funding, are going to realize the full potential of transformative change, because the safe bet is I'm going to buy some scaffolding that I can put on the outside of the unchanged structure of education. And when that money goes away, I'm going to take apart that scaffolding. And so I think we have to recognize that and support districts in planning for those long-term budget changes. And those are hard conversations. The thing I'll flag is another area that is generating a lot of interest. We do not have a lot of rigorous evidence about, but I think there's a clear theory of action, is the programs that fall under the umbrella of Grow Your Own.
Yeah.
And I think they speak to this notion that the educator labor market is hyper-localized. People teach close to where they grew up. They teach close to where they went to school. They teach close to where they were educated in teacher prep programs and where they did their student teaching. And we can build pipelines for people in the local community to serve their own community by breaking down some of the barriers to access to these programs, and by simply exposing people to the notion that this could be a career for you, and that can happen, and it is happening at the high school level, in courses, it's happening at the college level, and it's happening in schools where they're working with paraprofessionals and substitutes to help them access a teacher credential program and support them financially. And so I think we need to learn more about those, but the theory of action is clear, and there's gaining momentum, and it's also, I think, a powerful opportunity to achieve an incredibly important goal, which is to further develop a much more diverse teaching force that represents the students who we serve.
And another reminder, given the nature of that recommendation, that we should not expect overnight solutions, right? Growing your own teachers for the future is not something that is going to change instruction in a district next year. It's something that we're thinking long run. We need to be thinking both short and long run at the same time, I think, as we navigate this terrain. Heather, close us out.
All right. 2 pieces of advice. I think it's 2. The first is that sometimes when you are doing this work, it becomes so overwhelming that you don't know what to do. And so in my role at the state and in my role now at NCTQ, we have this mantra where we say, pick something. And try to ensure that it's evidence-based, but pick something and do the work. And I say that because I think you can come to these things and you leave so overwhelmed. So pick something, try to ensure it's evidence-based, and do the work. And then my second piece of advice is much more personal. My family is economically where we are today because my grandmother was a teacher, a reading specialist, and a principal of the first bilingual school in Miami-Dade County. My grandmother was almost 100 when she passed away during the pandemic of COVID. And what my grandmother would always tell us is that we need to set ourselves a high expectation for the work that we do. And when you're a kid, you never want to hear this. And so maybe some of you are like, oh, you're getting all preachy, Heather. But I am getting preachy on behalf of my grandmother. And she would say, to whom much is given, much is expected. Mm-hmm. To whom much is given, much is expected. You are sitting in seats of privilege and power from whatever walk you've come from. Much has been given, much is expected. And finally, I would say, be humble. Be humble. That's all I've got.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for bringing us home with advice to this audience. Folks, please join me in thanking our entire panel for their wisdom and expertise today.
Thank you guys. So nice to meet you. Good to see you.
And then please bear with me for 1 minute as I transition up here and close out the full event. So I want to, before we let everyone go, make sure that we thank you all for joining us today here at HGSE and those of you joining us online. And also thanking not just these folks, but all our speakers and panelists today for bringing their vision, their expertise, and their commitment to excellence to this conversation. As we've discussed throughout the day, we're at a pivotal moment for the field of education, a critical juncture for identifying and scaling effective practices that will support learners and educators alike. There is urgency, there are resources, there's a shared commitment to helping all students succeed, and there's no time to waste. Importantly, our goal can't simply be to get back to normal, to return to the status quo prior to the pandemic. As Peggy Carr's presentation this morning made clear, as Secretary Cardona argued an hour ago, the same students who bore the brunt of the pandemic's impact were already falling behind over the past decade. A return to normal will only reinforce rather than offset the pandemic's uneven consequences. In short, we called this convening beyond recovery because we believe that there is a higher standard that we can and must meet for all students. We tried to focus today on solutions to help reach that standard, solutions to accelerate learning, to support student well-being, and to rebuild the teaching profession. Solutions in each of these areas must be integrated with one another to create a cohesive and sustainable strategy. So it will take leadership across all aspects of the education sector to achieve the transformation we alluded to today. Policy, practice, and research, innovation, implementation, and assessment. We need a true collective effort so as not to let this moment of opportunity pass. But don't get overwhelmed. Pick something, try to make sure it's evidence-based, and as Heather just wisely told us, do the work. So Beyond Recovery will be a continuing theme for HGSE throughout this year. We'll continue to highlight the incredible work of our faculty, of our students, and of our alums. We'll continue to engage the field in this question of how best to transform education. So please be on the lookout for future events that will continue this conversation. In the meantime, safe travels to all of you. Have a good weekend, and we look forward to gathering again.